Okay, so to the podcast editor, we're starting panel conversation, thin privilege in practice. So welcome to the podcast, ladies.
Thank you.
Hello. Thank you for having us.
I was just saying to them in the pre-podcast conversation, this is my first ever panel conversation on the podcast. So you guys are gonna go on this territory with me.
We're ready.
Yeah.
So the conversation is about thin privilege in practice, and it stemmed from me Googling thin privilege in practice and finding nothing on Google. So the intention of this piece of content is to give tools and resources to practitioners and coaches who want to navigate their thin privilege in practice. I've heard from a lot of people that that's a struggle. I live in a fat body, so I'm going to pass the mic to people who have been practicing for years and have lived experience through that. So I thought we would start by defining thin privilege.
Okay.
Go for it, Julie.
Go for it, Julie.
Oh, okay. So thin privilege. I'm like, oh my gosh, that's a big one. So thin privilege for me as someone who has never, I've always been able to walk I've always been able to experience the world and been accommodated and always been considered acceptable. I'm also cisgender and white. And so I've been able always to find clothes that fit and have accessible healthcare. So thin privilege for me has meant that the world has always accommodated me just by looking at me. So, and I also think as a health professional, and in particular, I'm a dietitian. And I think in particular, dietetics is one that has a lot of inaccessibility for people who are not straight sized. I can remember people saying when I would go to interviews that, oh, you look like a dietitian. And not really appreciating what that meant for a long time. And now starting to really appreciate what that meant or what that means and how problematic that really is. So that's what thin privilege means so far to me.
Yeah, I think the piece on, I feel like often when you hold a privileged identity, you don't really have to think about it because it's not something like everywhere. You know, I also am thin, I'm white, cisgender, and growing up and still to this day, everywhere I look, I see me reflected back. And so I've never, whether it's movies or books or TV or wherever, you know, people that look like me show up. And that is not the case for a lot of folks, including fat folks. I also think of thin privilege as like, when we look at it, you know, Julie gave some great examples of how we live in this society that's designed for and like caters to and praises and lifts up thin bodies, smaller bodies. So like walking into a store, buying clothes, you know, your example of being a dietitian, being like, oh, you look like one, right? Because people look at us and they think like, oh, you're healthy because you're thin. You know, we're never assumed to be unhealthy just based on the size of our body. I think also just about, when we think about privilege and specific to body size, you know, by virtue of some just like characteristic of being in a smaller body, we have more like access to resources and more access to power, and we don't face discrimination because of the size of our body. So we're not like oppressed based on the size of our body. And I also think it's important to say, because, you know, some people listening might find themselves kind of like bristling a little bit with like this word privilege, and thin privilege especially. And I've heard people say like, well, I had an eating disorder, I struggle with body image. 100%, because having privilege doesn't mean you haven't suffered. It just means that, you know, and you could certainly like still have body image issues, because of our fucked up culture impact people of all sizes. But that's more like our internal thing, right? We're not like impacted by like structural or institutional sizeism. So I think that's like the other piece as well. And then also something that I think about is like having thin privilege. You might not even necessarily feel thin, because there's like no fixed or consistent meaning. But generally, I find that if we think about thin, it's like straight sized, meaning like in the US is size like 12 to 14 or smaller. So, you know, people that might be on the higher end of that might not feel thin, but like technically you're still being given more privilege than someone who's in a larger body than that. So I think that's another thing to just consider too. It's like you might not feel thin, but still benefit from thin privilege.
I think that was very good. So let's work from there. Why is it, I want to use the term essential for coaches and practitioners to acknowledge and make peace, I guess, with their thin privilege?
I mean, I would say, you know, it shows up in the room. Like no matter who we're working with, our bodies are in the room. And this was something Marcy Evans said, some version of this in a training I went 2 years ago, around how, you know, it's really powerful to like, to name that, maybe not the first session, but like to be aware of the privilege that you might have, especially when you're working with people in larger bodies and fat bodies. Because, you know, again, like you want them to be able to open up to you and like share their experience. And you have to, you know, not just be centering like the thin experience, right? Like just being open to like our biases that are built in. But yeah, like that, like Marcy said, like our bodies are in the room. And so like talking about that and acknowledging it in session, which then means we've had to do the work before getting into session, right? And to, yeah, just, you know, like I can say to clients, like, yeah, I don't know what it's like to go into a store and not find my size. Like, can you share how that makes me feel? Like being able to like talk openly about it, I think is really important.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And I think it's really important to acknowledge it, because even whether we acknowledge it or not, like it's there, you know, keep that in mind. And something that I'm just going to like name is like, I'm assuming that every coach is going to want to work with people of different sizes. And I'm hoping that like every coach is like, or I'm hoping there's no coach out there that's like, I'm only going to work with thin people as a thin person. So if you're one of those coaches that's like, I'm only going to work with thin people, well, then maybe you don't need to acknowledge your thin privilege. But if you are a coach who's in a thinner body or a straight size body, and then finding a way to unpack your thin privilege is going to be really important. And if you notice, as like when Alyssa was talking, and you kind of maybe felt some of that, like the cold pricklies, like the defensiveness that we all get as we connect to that privilege, finding a way to like just unpack that will be really important, because we all want to help people. And if we want to help people, then we need to do that. And, you know, I remember like when I first started doing the work on my own privilege and just like starting to examine the bias, I kind of laugh whenever I think about this. I remember I was a dietitian for maybe a year or two, and I was working with a lot of higher weight kids and their families. And I was working with this family where everyone in the family was higher weight. And a mom said to me, there's no way you could understand what we're going through. And I was like, okay, in my head, I was like, listen, I have been talking to people for the last couple of years, talking about the same thing over and over again. I get it. Like, I get it. I mean, I was probably all of 26 years old. And like, I mean, what did I really get? But I thought I really got everything. And I made a mistake in saying, I said, I understand. And she let me know, you do not understand what I am living through. And you have to make these mistakes really to be like told you do not understand. And as I made that mistake and this person helped me understand, I started to do better. And I then started to get some supervision, thankfully. And at that point, I didn't have a lot of supervision from dietitians, but I got some supervision from a therapist, and I discovered the world of counseling and coaching. And I decided to go back to become a back to school to become a counselor. And my very first day of counseling school, they're like, any questions? And I said, I have a question. What do you say when they say you don't understand? And my professor said, you say you're right. You say you're right. I don't understand. Like, I really, there's no way I can understand what you're experiencing. Help me understand. And I wish I would have said that, because there's no way I'm going to understand someone in a higher weight body. I've never had that experience. I'm never going to understand it, but I'm always going to seek to understand it. And that's something that when I'm in a relationship with people and who have a different lived experience, that's what I'm going to be doing from now on, is like seeking to understand it, however they will let me. And having that experience in a conversation, or however that relationship is going to be, to just talk about it, although it may feel uncomfortable. As someone with thin privilege, we've never had to talk about it, but that's on us, to feel uncomfortable and to talk about it.
That is so powerful, because that was the number one question I got from coaches, is how do we connect to their experience if I've never been considered fat?
Mm-hmm. Don't
And
say you understand it.
Yeah, we've learned that.
Because even if you've been doing this forever, like we don't get it. Like that was really insensitive of me, but also like I learned a lot by making that mistake. And I think that's also part of like being in a relationship with people, and like a coaching kind of experience is like, it can be really scary, but we're going to make mistakes. Like, that's why having mentorship and supervision is really important, because then we can learn how to do better. But relying on our clients to like, hey, can you help me understand what this is like for you? Like, just pausing and slowing things down to ask for that kind of insight and guidance. So then you can find out, instead of just assuming. Just don't assume.
Yeah.
I was going to say too, like the other piece of it, and I'm Julie, as you were telling that story, I was thinking of some of my own. And yeah, I think the other thing is too, well, first of all, like a lot of certainly dietitians, but I think in the health coaching field in particular, I'm assuming it's similar, where like a lot of them do have a lot of body privilege, and people might be coming to work with you consciously or subconsciously because of the size of your body, because they may have internalized fat phobia, right? And so we can't like help them unless we acknowledge, and kind of like bring that to the table. And I'm thinking of an example of, back when I had first kind of doing more of the non-diet and the weight inclusive work. And I, the topic of like social media came up when we talked about diversifying feeds and stuff like that. And I had like a list of people that I would send. It's like, oh, here are some recommendations. And who knows how many clients I sent that list to, until one said to me, she's like, look, their content's really great. It's been really helpful, but they're all thin white women. And I did not see that because of my privilege, right? And she said to me, and I felt so grateful that she felt like she could talk to me about this. She was like, their content's really great, but there is a part of me that when I see them and I think to myself, well, if I do this intuitive eating thing, then I will look like them. So like that is there, whether for her, it like came to consciousness as she was looking at this. I don't know if it was totally conscious before, but that's something that, I do hear that a lot from people. And so that can, maybe part of the reason they're coming to work with you. And, part of what we can help them do is like, if we understand thin privilege and like can acknowledge that, and like Julie said, like feel comfortable, like, or at least like start to feel comfortable, like speaking about this, then we can really like help them dig into that more too.
You bring up something really important, talking about that, like thinking about like why it's important to acknowledge thin privilege is because like we don't want to harm people, and we're going to harm people, but we want to do less harm. And so if we don't acknowledge it, then we are going to cause more harm. And so it's just another reason to address it and acknowledge it and do our own work to unpack it, is to do that. Cause like same here, Alyssa, with like my list of white providers or referrals, same. I have very similar kind of feedback received, and also reasons people have told me that they came to see me is because of my body was one that they felt like they could trust me because of my thin body, and not really knowing what to do with that for a really long time. And not really knowing how to unpack my own anti-fat bias. Like, what does that mean? And if I open this up, what am I going to do with it? But I think it's really important to do if we want to prevent harm as much as possible. Yeah.
So what do we do with that? When a client say to us, like, I'm choosing to work with you, there's many providers, I'm choosing to work with you because I may lose weight, or I may end up looking like you because look, you're doing intuitive eating and you look like this.
Yeah, my go-to has always been, ooh, tell me more about that.
Oh, that's a counselor.
Yep.
And tell me about because like there's like probably magical thinking, and what I want to hear about the promises that they're hoping are going to happen based on how I appear. And what starts to happen then in the session is unpacking what my body in the room then. And I know that can be really scary as a coach, is like, how do I bring up my body? But having that, like, tell me more about that statement is going to bring up your body then. Yes. And if you don't want to be the one to bring it up, that statement will bring it up. But sometimes you have to be the one to bring it up. And, but yeah, that right there usually is what does it. So.
Yeah. The tell me more is always great. And I think that leads to like helping them unpack their, what's behind their desire for weight loss and like all of these things. And yeah, I think that usually gets there, but if not, like, yeah, you might have to kind of like call some attention to like, okay, I'm aware of the fact that I'm in a thin body and that you live in a different body. And like, what is that like for you? And how does that impact our work here together? And like actually having a conversation. And that's something that, again, I'm not necessarily having in like session one. There's like relationship building that has to happen. But yeah, I think that that's something that's definitely really important to bring up if it's not coming up in session.
Let's go to the power of words, because that's another big concern, discomfort. Like, what word do I use as a thin privilege coach or provider to talk about body? Any insight on that?
Alyssa and I are both looking at each other. Who wants to go first?
Who's going to go for this one?
I know it depends. So you can go first, Alyssa.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think that there's a difference in talking about groups of people and talking about an individual person's body. So when I talk about groups of people, and this has been something I've like, and language is always changing. So always just to say that first. And these are the things that, I am learning from people in fat bodies and like from the fat activists. Like, that's who I'm going to like see like language and like, because that's right. That's them. That's not my identity. And so this was actually, when I was writing my book last year, this was something that I spoke with one of my equity consultants with, Lindley Ashline, who actually speaks a lot. Lindley is a fat white woman, but she speaks a lot about thin privilege. And I asked her, I said, because I'd read something by Aubrey Gordon of Your Fat Friend, saying a piece in a Medium article by her saying like, just say fat. And I was saying to Lindley, like, what should I do? Because, I was using like larger body or higher weight. And it brought up this conversation about like, okay, if we say larger weight body or higher weight, larger than what? Higher than what? Like, it's still in some ways centering the thin body. So, in speaking of groups of people, I am trying, I use a balance, right? Because then Lindley said, well, if you're using fat like everywhere, people who are still kind of like triggered by that, like that could be really challenging for them. So I ended up in my book, and I do this in like my writing and speaking and stuff. When I'm speaking about groups of people, I'll use both larger body or higher weight, but I also make sure I'm saying smaller body, lower weight. So it's not like centering thin as like the quote normal. But also using the word fat, because yes, there's been a lot of negative connotations that society has assigned to it, but it's not inherently a bad word. And many of the, people in the body liberation and fat acceptance space have been like reclaiming that word as an adjective to describe their body size, like taking back kind of the power from it, and using it can help to start to destigmatize it. So in groups of people, I'll use like a combination of those words, and just continue to keep learning. But I think, when it comes to the individual, that's up to them to decide how they want to describe their body. And so again, I feel like Julie, you might have some insight on this, but I think that's again, like a conversation to have with the person. Like I have some clients who have like been in whether like the previous kind of like body positivity community or like the fat acceptance community, and they've become more comfortable using fat to describe their bodies, but a lot of my clients have not. And so, that's just something, again, we talk about, because we never want to assume how someone identifies or assume or like put a label on them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100%. I'm totally aligned with you on that. And when I am talking, I do a lot of teaching nutrition students about weight inclusive care, and I will intentionally do the same thing that you described, like weaving in, higher weight and lower weight, straight size, and like using different terms, but I will intentionally use the word fat, and try then to also use that as a way to describe like how it's a neutral descriptor, and like try to also say like, this is not something that I will throw around just to use all the time. This is something that I will not use with a client without their specific instruction. I would want my client to give me the direction of how they would like me to how to refer to their body, if at all. Like I'm not going to be referring to their body in any certain way unless they give me direction to. And because of talking in a lot of body liberation spaces, like a lot of the O words have been kind of activated in my brain. So whenever I hear people using those words to describe themselves, I kind of have like almost like a little activated part in my body. But clients will use those words, and I do not want to tell them to stop until it's time in the process to do that. As rapport building is happening, there's going to come a point to do that. Because that's the word that they're using at the time, and there. So I see you wanting to say something.
I just want to clarify, like this piece of content is intended for anyone on the spectrum of practice, or what the heck is an O word? Like, let's talk to the beginners. You know what I'm saying?
Okay.
Like you're using things that I know, but I know some people like,
I don't even want to say the words,
I know. We're going to use air quotes.
Okay. So I'm going to use the air quotes: overweight and obese. Okay. So, and clients will often still use those words to describe their bodies. And sometimes if they're wanting me to use those words, that's when I will bring up, it's hard for me to use those words for these reasons. And sometimes that will bring about a really great conversation. And I'll talk about how, at times I feel more comfortable using the words higher weight. But often I will just let my client decide how they're going to use the words they're going to use to describe their bodies. But often it's like, I don't need words to describe their bodies. I don't know about you all, but it ends up not really being that necessary. The majority of the time, it's really when I'm doing presentations or advocating for clients, that's when I need it the most. But I will need it from the client. Then how do you want me to advocate for you? How would you like me to describe your body to your doctor or whatever? And I think it is really important to use what they are directing us to use. Yeah.
I think that brings up the notion of asking for consent.
100%. Yes.
Right.
So important, because there's
asking for the consent to talk about the body, depending on what they hired you for, which package or program. and then which language to use to talk about their body.
100%. Yeah.
So let's go into then. So we've got the power of word, we've got the notion of consent, we understand thin privilege. Let's go into then, okay, I understand all of that. So then what's my role as a coach in helping them? Like, if I can't connect, I don't understand their experience, what role do I play in their journey with intuitive eating or body image from that place? I don't know if I'm clear, but do you guys get what I'm saying?
I think so. Like, I always see my role as one as relational. Like, my role as, I'm a dietitian. My role is someone to partner with someone on their food peace journey. So I'm going to meet someone where they are. And again, as a thin person, there's going to be parts that I can help with, and there may be parts that I can't. And, being in a place where I can relate on some level, there's going to be some parts that I can't relate, and I still maybe be able to help, just to be partnering with them and listening. And a big part of my work is permission and using permission kind of techniques along the way. And again, there comes a time for many people where lived experience is important. And so it's okay as a thin provider at times to step aside, and I think that's been a really important for me in my own supervision with mentors to find, to be okay with that. Like, there are times where I need to refer out. So, yeah.
Good one.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think, because I do similar work around, helping people come back to their bodies and, make peace with food and some body image work. But yeah, I know fully that, like, I can probably only take someone in a larger body so far. And at some point, like, it is going to be helpful for them to work with someone who looks like them or who can more identify with their lived experience. But I think, for a lot, if not all of my clients, I'm really the first provider that they've worked with who's not telling them to lose weight and is instead asking about their experience. So like Julie said, the like relational part, and just to ask their experience and like, understanding the privilege and like coming from a more weight inclusive place and really wanting, like, seeking to understand and helping them start to unpack that. And so I think that that's really powerful. Like, you can certainly partner with people with their, food and health goals from that perspective. And it's really powerful to be able to do that with, knowing your own privilege and your own kind of like internalized bias, and having unpacked that and having, done that. And then, it's also powerful to know, like, okay, I think that it's going to be more helpful for you at this point. Like, I've kind of taken you as far as I can, like, I think, and then helping them kind of seek out, and, whether it's initially through like social media, or like, I'm very, after that, instance years ago, where my client called me in, like, I am super intentional with like the people that I send folks to follow, or like books to read, or, really just trying to start to get them to like, be consuming content and learning from people who have different experiences than I, and are more similar to their experience.
And I'm sure the counselor and Julie will agree, our role is not to quote fix, it's facilitating their healing.
Yeah. I mean, we're not the ones that have the keys, we're just like the ones that have the like honor to be near them when they're doing the work. Right. So, do we get to be there for a lot of it or some of it? Like, that's up to the client. So, yeah.
So let's go to the next place. Is we kind of have much better understanding of how to facilitate our thin privilege and our coaching practice. Now, how do we use our privilege, our thin privilege, or do we use our thin privilege beyond our practice? Like, how can we help the world using our thin privilege.
Yeah, you have to use it. Otherwise it's a waste.
Right. Right. That was something, I think it was Mackenzie Mack, who was another equity consultant I work with on my book. And they said to me, they're like, it doesn't help anyone for you to feel guilty about being thin or feel guilty about being white, you know? And so this is, and something they said to me that I like come back to all the time is like, yes, you've been given this power unjustly and given this privilege unjustly through nothing that you've done. So how can you use that power to advocate for others, to give back, to pass the mic, to amplify other voices? And so, yeah, like Julie said, like, I think about it now of like, yeah, I'm not always going to do it, quote unquote, right. I'm going to mess up, but I'm learned I like really need to be willing to put myself out there, because me just being silent and not using any of this privilege and power that I have, especially in the health field, you know, so just some like specifics, like, for example, I'm, way more intentional now when I get like media interviews. Like I usually, well, I'll first media interviews, podcast interviews, I'll ask like who else they're quoting. If it's a podcast, I look at who else they've had on. If there's like no people of color or no people in diverse body sizes, I tell them that, you know, I won't participate because of XYZ reason. And I actually have a list of people that I like refer them to, for different opinions. Same with like speaking, gigs now, like depending on what it is, like that's also something that I try to pass on. So yeah, just, you know, I get a lot of that outreach because of what I look like. And like, how can I then take what comes into me and like disperse that to others who don't have that privilege, the body privilege.
Yeah. I think another part of it too is like, I think it's important for those of us who have thin privilege, especially those of us who are white and cisgender too, is to have more practice taking like personal responsibility and have more practice like with that defensive kind of feeling we all get when we get feedback, because it can throw us into like a trauma kind of response, and it can be really uncomfortable. Thank you, white supremacy. And so it's up to us to be okay if we want to do better with receiving feedback and doing better. So especially if we want to like not waste the privilege, you know, and be able to do less harm and make change in the world. So yeah, like that's one big thing that I've been thinking a lot about is like, how can I take personal responsibility and use this privilege for good and not promote harm or more harm, really.
Yeah. And another shout out for supervision there.
Yes, another shout out for supervision.
I think I'm part of a group right now. And I think also finding spaces where you have people who will hold you accountable, but will also like hold you in like, yeah, it can be a trauma response, or even if it's not, like it can be really uncomfortable and really, like guilt can come up and like shame. And like, so people that can kind of hold you in that while also holding you accountable, I think is so important. Because something happened like a month or so ago, and like being able to have that space where like they were holding me accountable, but also I felt like I could like be myself and show up, and like diffusing the shame was so important.
It's so important to have that. I'm so glad you have that, because someone told me you always need to have someone you can go to when you need support, when you need someone to make you feel good, warm fuzzies, but you also need someone to go to when you have hurt someone who's not going to necessarily make you feel good. Like when you need to be told the hard stuff. The person's name is Michelle Nicole. So it was, I can't remember Michelle Nicole's last name at this point, but I can give it to you if you need it for the show notes. But that was one of the best advice I ever got, because sometimes we're going to get feedback and we need to like sit with like, oh, I may have hurt someone, or I did hurt someone. Help me sit with this icky feeling. And especially those of us within privilege, we're going to be doing this often, you know? And if we want to really do better, we need to practice doing better.
So here's a simple question, but I think it's going to unfold other things. Does that mean I have to acknowledge thin privilege on every piece of content that I make and every social media post that I make?
When I was in my counseling program, the same professor who I was like, help me with this question. He said, you just have to really always know it in your brain, like always know that you have this privilege, like in every thought, like, so you, and there may be times you have to acknowledge it. And this was before we had social media, so I don't know what he would say now. Dr. Spurgeon, what would you say to this? But so I don't necessarily, I'm not saying I'm doing it right or wrong, but like, I don't necessarily say with every social media post or podcast that I record, but I think it's something that we have to always be keeping in mind. And there is a tension with everything I create of like, I feel myself at a fork in a road a lot of like, is this where I need to step aside, or is this where I need to use my privilege for good? You know, and it feels like a tension kind of constantly. And it's one of those both and kind of things. Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah, no, I relate to that a lot. And I think you're right. There's not necessarily like a right or wrong answer, but I think it is the making sure that like whatever I'm creating, which at this point, yes, is a lot of like social media and like blog article type writing, that I am keeping that in mind and being open to, I can't remember who this was, but I saw someone do this recently and I was like, I need to start doing this on my posts. They literally wrote at the end, what did I miss? Let me know.
Ooh,
and I was like,
that.
That's amazing. Cause it's like, I know I'm going to miss stuff.
Yes.
And I do have followers in a community who will let me know, which is great.
Yes.
And I appreciate that. And then I update or add to it or like shout them out for what they shared, because I think that's, being open to that feedback, and being able to like listen and adjust and like take that feedback. So no, I agree. It's probably not necessary to like disclose that or disclaim that everywhere. But I do think like that's the lens through which I see the world. And that's the lens through which like, well, yes, I'm like listening and learning from lots of different people. That's still the lens I've seen the world for, almost 40 years. So it's like that that's where I'm coming from with it. So certainly when I do talks, I always say at the beginning, if I'm doing a podcast where you can't see me, I like work that in somewhere if it's not in my bio. Like I think Julie and I both did today at the beginning. So yeah, just to, make sure people kind of understand, and then, yeah, what am I missing?
I love that so much.
It's on my notepad.
Me too.
So I do, and that down. I can't remember who that was, or else I'd give them credit. But I was like, saw that recently, and I'm like, I need to start doing that.
I think that's the other part too that is probably adjacent to this, but as part of thin privilege, but like as thin and probably like white too, is like we've been stealing things for a long time, and so making sure that we are like naming, like where we get things and. I love that part of like, let me know what I can do better is so great. That and normalizing feedback. Yes. So then people can hopefully then feel, I don't know if safe is the right word, but eventually feel like it feels safe enough to give feedback, because they may not always feel safe enough to give feedback. But if it's like repeated enough, eventually then hopefully people then can feel like they could. Yeah. That's such a great idea.
We're going to bring this conversation to a close.
No.
It was so good. You guys think it's good?
Yes.
Oh yeah. That's okay. Great.
So if you have anything we think we missed, did I miss anything? Right? Is there an angle of this that I haven't brought up, or the question come up that you would like to make sure is on this piece of content?
Oh, you're asking us.
Yeah.
You're asking the audience.
Did I miss anything? I want you to tell me, because I like this. This is you, right?
I'm just looking back at the questions you had asked me a couple of years ago on that, which I think you asked most of these here. I guess, yeah, Julie did talk about this, but you had a question about like how to address people's objection of like, well, it's easy for you to accept your body and give up weight loss. I don't know if you want to like more specifically do that question.
Sure.
Yeah, I think that's
So what
the
would you
main
answer
one.
to this? What would be your reply if a client says that to you?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, yeah, you're right. It is easier for me because I live in a body that's considered socially acceptable. And I think it's really important that and this was something I did not know when I first started doing this work. And yeah, I had posts about like, oh, just give up on weight loss because weight loss doesn't work. And it's like, okay, it's one thing to know weight loss doesn't work, but like, these are really valid fears that people have, right? Because they see how fat people are treated in our society and they may have experienced that discrimination and that oppression. And so I think we need to leave space into like, again, like you said before, we're not fixing, but allowing them space to like voice the fears of like what they're giving up if they move away from attempting to lose weight. Because yeah, it can be belonging, right? Like I have clients whose families are just like never going to accept their weight. And so like, if they are working towards body acceptance and moving away from dieting, like they're going to like that relationship with their family is going to be different. And so, yeah, there's definitely like very valid fears. So I think we need to leave room for that and allow them to voice them and like validate that, yes, this makes so much sense why you're worried about this.
Yeah. Yeah. And leave space for clients to choose to do what they want in those scenarios. Like that was something that I made a lot of mistakes in for way too long because I didn't understand that part of my lived experience and thin privilege of like rejecting diets. And again, like how even if a person's weight didn't change, just how dieting improved access to healthcare and family acceptance. And so if a client was like, I just want to diet until my family reunion or whatever, and I can recall just really pressuring people to not. And now looking back, really being like, I wish I hadn't done that. And because I don't see it as supportive now as I probably was, because I wasn't really holding on to, I was blinded by my privilege. And it's, that was long ago. So I really would need to talk to the person now and be like, oh, what was I missing? But there's going to be times where people are going to choose what's best from them. And that's where body autonomy is a big part of this conversation. We haven't really talked about that part. We talked a little bit about consent, but when we bring up thin privilege, I think body autonomy is part of that conversation too. And as I really started to unpack thin privilege, I needed to acknowledge how clients with different lived experiences were going to choose different things because of their different lived experiences. And that may mean then they weren't going to be working with me anymore. And because one of my like lines of like, I can't work with you anymore is if you were going to like start to pursue weight loss and a dieting plan, I will help you like decide if you're going to do it and all those things. But like, I was just really transparent. Like if you're like doing it, I'm not going to be the best choice anymore. So I had to be okay with that, and I also was like really transparent. Like I would love to have you back whenever you're ready. Like, cause this is your decision and people would come back, and it would be on their terms. And there was really the thing that's really great about having a 20-year career with clients is you get to see that. And it's hard in the beginning to know that will happen. It can be really scary to be like, oh my gosh, I'm never gonna have clients again. They're all gonna leave me if they all leave to go dieting when I'm like starting to do this anti-diet work and everybody else is dieting. But yeah, if people experience you in a session to be compassionate and like helping to like have like the body autonomy that they never were able to have with other clinicians, then they get to decide, then they will come back when the time is right, if it ever is, So
That was
I'm
a
so
great
glad you
piece
brought
of
that up.
wisdom.
Mhm.
Oh, good.
I was also just going to add to that too, for like the providers listening, like there's nothing that you did wrong if they decide that that's what they want to do, right?
Yes.
Because I think that can be something that I know I've experienced this of being like, well,
yes.
I couldn't fix them, right? Like I couldn't, this is my fault that they're going back to dieting. But no, like Julie, you talked about that so beautifully of like, yeah, the trauma that someone experiences, like it can feel safe to diet and like
Mhm.
it can open up all these things, right? Like, I mean, so many examples, but yeah, there are people who like won't get life-saving surgery unless they lose weight, or just like,
Mhm.
even if it just is, yeah, all these different things. And I think that leaving space for that, leaving space for those conversations. I've had my team and I have had some clients where we've been discussing this in our like group supervision around a client wanted to start like tracking calories again because was feeling like very anxious about food intake. And so one of my team members was like, okay, like, if you want to try that for a week, let's come back next week and talk about it. Like, how did that feel? And like, again, to Julie's point, if she was really like, okay, I'm going to like continue doing this long term, that would probably be someone we would hand off. But to like leave that space, not be like, no, you shouldn't do
Mhm.
that.
Mhm.
But, I've had clients too, where, and again, when you build that like trusting relationship where you're not, there might be that initial, like when you're talking about the, quote, overweight and obese, I too get that like, but that's part of the thing, right? Like not letting that judgment that you might have internally kind of show, and just being able to understand that, because I've had clients who, were gone for a couple of weeks and came back and they're like, I went back to my Weight Watchers app for a few weeks. And I was like, thank you so much for telling me, like, how was that?
Yeah.
Right. And
Mhm.
because of our work together, we were able to like process it together. And she was like, you know what? Like at first it felt good, but then like, again, similar to all the other temps. So we were able to like talk about it, and she felt like she could tell me, which I felt again was like very powerful. And yes, I'm in more like the 5 to 6 year mark of doing this. And really just in the last year or two, Julie, I've seen what you're experiencing. Like I just had 2 former clients this summer email me out of the blue after a couple of years. And they were clients who didn't like completely leave to go back to dieting, but kind of when we finished, it was like a little like uncertain. And they both said, they've been continuing the work in various ways. And like multiple years later, reached out to be like, the seeds you planted and like this stuff. And so it comes back around, and so we have to, the body autonomy is so big, and just leaving space for that and not trying to force someone to do what we think they should do.
Planting seeds. Like this is where our industry is at right now. Like that's the stage we're planting seeds, and these seeds are going to grow. You just have to trust that in different ways. And it's going to be for the best of the people, our client, and the world. We just got to be patient.
My friend Laura Watson always says we have to pour Miracle Grow on it sometimes, though.
I love that.
I know. Isn't it great?
This was a very powerful conversation.
Thank you for having it.
We can do panel conversation on podcasts. This was
you can
brilliant.
do it, Stephanie. You're the host. You got it.
Yeah, this is fun. I love it.
This was fun. It's going to serve thousands of people, like literally thousands of practitioners are going to listen to this, and we're going to impact thousands of clients at the end of this. So thank you very much, both of you, for your time. We're going to put your information in the show note. Do you both do supervision? I'm not sure if you do.
I have very limited supervision at this point. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, same. I do some supervision and some business coaching. And I do have some resources. I can send you the link, like specific for clinicians, because I do have some resources there for them.
Perfect. So we'll put that in the show note if anyone wants to reach out to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Stephanie, for having us.
How is it?